In a faded Victorian photograph taken in 1871, a woman is surrounded by her children and her stepson, Charles Edward, her gentle smile radiating maternal warmth. The image captures what appears to be a loving family moment, a widow finding happiness after enduring multiple bereavements. Her dark dress, appropriate for someone still mourning past losses, contrasts with the radiant faces of the children gathered around her. To any observer, this photograph would represent resilience, hope, and the triumph of love over tragedy. But hidden within this innocent family portrait lies one of the most shocking secrets in Victorian criminal history. The woman whose tender embrace shelters these children would become known as one of Britain's most notorious criminals. By the time this photograph was taken, Mary Ann Cotton was already suspected by some of being connected to numerous mysterious deaths within her household. The caring hands that rest protectively on young shoulders had been present at too many deathbeds to be mere coincidence. Most significantly, 7-year-old Charles Edward Cotton, who gazes trustingly up at his stepmother in this portrait, would become the final victim whose death would expose a decades-long pattern of suspicious mortality. His case would trigger the investigation that would unravel one of history's most shocking criminal careers and bring justice to a woman who had evaded suspicion for nearly 20 years. This photograph, preserved in the archives of Durham County, serves as a haunting reminder that appearances can be devastatingly deceptive. Behind Mary Ann Cotton's gentle exterior lay a calculating mind that had turned domestic life into something unspeakably dark, transforming the Victorian ideal of motherhood into a facade for criminal activity. The story of how a coal miner's daughter from County Durham became England's most infamous woman begins. In the industrial landscape of 1832, where economic hardship and social pressures would shape a character capable of unthinkable acts. Her journey from poverty to infamy reveals the dangerous intersection of desperation, opportunity, and a complete absence of moral conscience. Mary Ann Robson entered the world on October 31st, 1832, in Low Moorsley, County Durham, where the coal mining industry dominated every aspect of life. The landscape bore the permanent scars of industrial progress, with slag heaps rising like black mountains against the gray sky. Her father, Michael Robson, divided his time between working dangerous shifts deep underground and serving as a Methodist lay preacher, creating a household where religious devotion coexisted uneasily with the harsh realities of working-class survival. The Robson family lived in a cramped terraced house typical of mining communities, where privacy was impossible and every family crisis became neighborhood knowledge. Michael's work in the mines was slowly destroying his health, as coal dust accumulated in his lungs with each passing year. His wife Margaret managed their modest household with the kind of stern efficiency that poverty demanded, stretching every penny and making difficult decisions about family priorities. With ruthless practicality, young, Mary Ann was an intelligent child who quickly learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of her community. She observed how neighbors responded to death and misfortune, noting which families received sympathy and support while others faced suspicion and isolation. The Methodist chapel provided moral instruction about good and evil, but the daily struggle for survival taught different lessons about the flexibility of ethical boundaries when necessity demanded adaptation. When Michael Robson succumbed to lung disease in 1842, his death brought both grief and practical challenges that would profoundly influence Mary Ann's understanding of mortality and opportunity. The funeral expenses strained the family's already tight finances, while Margaret's need to remarry quickly demonstrated how death could create both problems and solutions. The arrival of stepfather George Stott brought additional income, but also tension and conflict that made their household an uncomfortable place for a growing girl, Mary Ann's formative. Years in this environment taught her that survival required careful observation of human nature, strategic thinking about relationships, and the ability to present whatever face others needed to see. These skills would serve her well in the years ahead, though in ways that would shock Victorian society and establish her place in criminal history. By 1852, 20-year-old Mary Ann had developed into an attractive young woman whose intelligence and apparent respectability made her a desirable prospect in the limited marriage market available to working-class girls. Her beauty was complemented by practical domestic skills and a keen understanding of what Victorian men sought in a wife: devotion, competence, and the kind of moral character that reflected well on their own standing in the community. William Mowbray, a railway laborer with steady employment, represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Mary Ann had been carefully preparing herself to recognize and seize. The railway industry offered more security than mining, and William's position provided both regular wages and social respectability. Their courtship followed the prescribed patterns of Victorian propriety, with chaperoned meetings and careful attention to community expectations about appropriate behavior. Mary Ann's approach to courtship revealed the calculating intelligence that would characterize her entire adult life. She presented herself as the ideal Victorian woman, modest, domestic, and completely dedicated to creating a comfortable home for her future husband. William was charmed by her apparent contentment with simple pleasures and her obvious skills in household management. Their engagement was brief but proper, with Mary Ann demonstrating exactly the kind of feminine virtues that Victorian society prized most highly. Their wedding in July 1852 was a modest celebration that marked Mary Ann's successful transition from coal miner's daughter to railway worker's wife, a significant improvement in social status that represented the first of many strategic advances she would make throughout her life. The ceremony was held in the local Methodist chapel, surrounded by neighbors who saw the union as a fortunate match for both parties. The early months of marriage established patterns that would define Mary Ann's approach to all her subsequent relationships. She proved herself an exceptional housewife, managing their finances with impressive skill and maintaining their home to standards that impressed even the most critical neighbors. But beneath this performance of domestic perfection, Mary Ann was conducting a different kind of evaluation entirely, assessing her husband's value and planning for various future scenarios that might require significant changes in their arrangements. Mary Ann's early years as Mrs. Mowbray were marked by the arrival of several children, and her growing understanding of how Victorian society's acceptance of high infant mortality could provide opportunities for those clever enough to exploit societal assumptions. Margaret Isabella was born in 1853, followed by Margaret Jane in 1855, establishing Mary Ann as a devoted mother whose apparent dedication to her children impressed neighbors and community leaders alike. The Mowbray household appeared to represent Victorian domestic ideals, with William working long hours to provide for his growing family, while Mary Ann managed their home with remarkable efficiency. Community members frequently commented on her devotion to her children and her apparent satisfaction with the role of wife and mother. Local Methodist leaders held up the Mowbrays as an example of proper Christian family life, with Mary Ann's regular attendance at chapel services reinforcing her reputation for moral rectitude. However, tragedy began to strike the Mowbray family with disturbing frequency beginning in 1856. Little Margaret Isabella fell seriously ill with symptoms that the local doctor attributed to gastric fever, a common diagnosis for childhood ailments in an era when medical knowledge remained primitive and diagnostic tools were virtually non-existent. Mary Ann's response to her daughter's illness was exemplary, sitting vigil by the child's bedside and administering care with the kind of maternal devotion that impressed everyone who witnessed it. The child's death was devastating to William, but seemed to strengthen Mary Ann's resolve to protect her remaining family members. The small insurance policy provided modest compensation, though nothing could truly offset the loss of a child. Community members rallied around the grieving family, offering support and comfort during their time of bereavement. When Margaret Jane began showing similar symptoms months later, concern grew within the community about possible environmental factors that might be affecting the Mowbray children. Mary Ann's dedicated nursing of her second daughter was even more intensive than her care of Margaret Isabella, leading neighbors to praise her extraordinary maternal devotion. However, some community members began to notice the unusual pattern of illness that seemed to affect children in Mary Ann's care, though such observations remained private conversations, rather than public accusations. William Mowbray's death in January 1865 marked a turning point in Mary Ann's life that would set the stage for decades of criminal activity. Disguised as personal misfortune, William had been experiencing declining health for several months, symptoms that his colleagues attributed to the physical demands of railway work and his grief over losing his children. The local doctor found nothing unusual in his gradual deterioration, particularly given the family's recent losses and the harsh working conditions common to Victorian laborers. Mary Ann's behavior during William's final illness established patterns that would characterize all her subsequent relationships with victims. She rarely left his bedside, preparing special meals and administering treatments with the kind of dedicated care that impressed the entire community. Her apparent devotion was so complete that neighbors frequently commented on her extraordinary commitment to her husband's welfare, even as his condition continued to worsen despite her efforts. The insurance settlement from William's death provided Mary Ann with enough financial security to live independently while planning her next moves. More importantly, his death taught her valuable lessons about community expectations and the power of maintaining proper appearances during times of crisis. Victorian society's sympathy for young widows created opportunities for women who understood how to navigate social conventions while pursuing their own interests. Within months of William's funeral, Mary Ann had begun planning her relocation to Seaham Harbor, where her tragic history would be unknown and she could establish a fresh reputation. This decision reflected her growing understanding that mobility was essential for avoiding the kind of scrutiny that might arise if too many suspicious deaths occurred within a single community. Her grief appeared genuine to observers, but her practical preparations for a new life demonstrated a remarkable ability to combine emotional performance with strategic planning. The move to Seaham Harbor represented Mary Ann's first deliberate attempt to reinvent herself in a new community, a strategy that would serve her well in the years ahead. She had learned to present herself as a victim of cruel fate rather than someone who might be connected to the misfortunes that seemed to follow her wherever she went. This reinvention would prove crucial to her ability to continue her activities without detection for nearly 2 more decades. Marianne's arrival in Seaham Harbor in 1865 demonstrated her growing sophistication in the art of community integration and victim selection. She presented herself as a respectable widow seeking honest work and a quiet life, a presentation that immediately gained her sympathy and acceptance from neighbors who admired her apparent courage in facing adversity. Her reputation for domestic skills and moral character spread quickly through the tight-knit community. George Ward, a colliery foreman whose steady income and bachelor status made him an attractive prospect, became the focus of Marianne's attention within weeks of her arrival. Ward represented a significant improvement over her previous situation. His position provided higher wages and greater social status, while his lack of previous marriage meant fewer complications regarding existing family relationships that might prove difficult to manage. Their courtship progressed with remarkable speed, aided by Marianne's perfected performance as a woman seeking nothing more than companionship and security after experiencing devastating losses. Ward was completely enchanted by her combination of beauty, domestic competence, and apparent vulnerability. Community members viewed their developing relationship as a fortunate outcome for both parties, a good man providing protection for a deserving widow, and a capable woman offering domestic comfort to a hardworking bachelor. Their marriage in August 1865 was celebrated as a happy occasion that provided hope and stability after Marianne's previous misfortunes. The ceremony was well attended by Ward's colleagues and neighbors who had grown fond of Marianne during her brief residence in Seaham Harbor. The couple established themselves in comfortable lodgings that reflected Ward's improved economic status and Marianne's exceptional household management skills. However, the marriage lasted only 14 months, ending with Ward's death in March 1866, under circumstances that followed a now familiar pattern of gradual illness and apparent natural causes. The local doctor attributed his death to occupational hazards common in mining communities, where industrial accidents and work-related diseases were sadly routine. Marianne's grief appeared genuine, and the substantial insurance settlement provided her with the financial means to continue her pattern of relocation and reinvention. Marianne's third marriage represented her most ambitious social advancement and would ultimately provide her with the identity that would make her historically infamous. Frederick Cotton was a deputy overman at a West Auckland colliery, a position that granted him considerable respectability and financial security within the local community. His comfortable house and established social connections represented opportunities that far exceeded anything Marianne had previously encountered. Frederick Cotton was a widower struggling to manage his household and raise his children alone following his wife's death in 1865. His domestic situation was complicated by the presence of several children from his previous marriage, including young Charles Edward Cotton, whose fate would eventually trigger the investigation that would expose Marianne's criminal career. When Marianne arrived in West Auckland in 1867, presenting herself as an experienced housekeeper seeking employment, Frederick found her to be exactly the solution he had been seeking. Marianne's integration into the Cotton household demonstrated her remarkable ability to assess and manipulate complex family dynamics. She quickly established herself as indispensable to Frederick's daily routine, while simultaneously winning the affection and trust of his children. Her apparent devotion to the family impressed neighbors who viewed her as a godsend. For a man struggling with the challenges of single parenthood, the couple's marriage in September 1867 was a significant social event in West Auckland, with Frederick's colleagues and community leaders attending the ceremony. Mary Ann Cotton, the name she would carry into infamy, had successfully positioned herself as a respectable member of a prominent local family. Her transformation from coal miner's daughter to deputy overman's wife represented a remarkable social advancement that reflected her intelligence and strategic thinking. However, Frederick Cotton's comfortable circumstances also created new challenges for Mary Ann's activities. His established position in the community meant that unusual events in their household would attract more attention than had been the case with her previous, more anonymous living situations. The presence of multiple children with various legal and financial connections created complex situations that would require careful management to avoid suspicion while still providing opportunities for financial gain. The most dangerous period in Mary Ann's criminal career began with her relationship with James Robinson, a shipwright from Sunderland whose natural intelligence and suspicious nature would nearly expose her activities years before her eventual capture. This relationship represented a significant departure from her usual pattern of complete mobility and careful victim selection, creating vulnerabilities that would plague her for years to come. Following Frederick Cotton's death in December 1867, Mary Ann faced the familiar challenge of managing her widowed status while planning her next moves. Instead of relocating to an entirely new area, as had been her established practice, she made the crucial error of maintaining connections in the West Auckland region, while simultaneously developing a relationship with Robinson. This decision created dangerous overlaps between her past and present identities that would prove nearly catastrophic. Robinson possessed qualities that distinguished him from her previous victims: a naturally analytical mind, broader education, and social connections that extended beyond the isolated working-class communities where Marianne had previously operated. Their relationship began promisingly from Marianne's perspective, with Robinson apparently charmed by her beauty and apparent vulnerability as a widow struggling to care for multiple children from her previous marriages. By August 1868, Marianne had moved into Robinson's household as both housekeeper and romantic partner, creating a complex domestic arrangement that included several children from her previous relationships. This situation represented the first time Marianne had attempted to maintain her activities while living with someone who possessed the intelligence and social connections to recognize patterns that might indicate criminal behavior. The crisis began when children in Mary Ann's care started experiencing health problems with suspicious frequency and consistency. Robinson observed the illnesses affecting Frederick Cotton Jr. and Robert Robson Mowbray with growing alarm, particularly noting similarities in symptoms and progression that seemed to defy coincidence. When his own son began showing similar signs of illness, Robinson's suspicions crystallized into directed confrontation, the first time in Marianne's criminal career that anyone had been willing to voice accusations openly and take decisive action to protect potential victims. Robinson's dramatic confrontation, an ultimatum in 1868, forced Marianne to flee his household under circumstances that left her more vulnerable than at any previous point in her criminal career. For the first time, she faced direct accusations of involvement in suspicious deaths, and her usual strategy of presenting herself as a victim of cruel fate had been rejected by someone who understood her true nature. The situation created unprecedented challenges that required careful management to avoid complete exposure. The period of exile that followed Robinson's accusations was marked by financial difficulties and limited options for establishing new relationships. Marianne's resources were constrained, and her need to maintain distance from communities where she might be known created additional complications in her search for new opportunities. The experience taught her valuable lessons about the importance of complete mobility and the dangers of maintaining connections that might create uncomfortable overlaps between her various identities. Her eventual return to West Auckland in 1870 represented a calculated risk that demonstrated both her desperation and her continued confidence in her ability to manipulate community perceptions. She secured lodgings with John Quickmanning, a local excise officer whose position provided her with the respectability she needed to rebuild her social standing. Quickmanning found Marianne to be an exemplary tenant whose quiet respectability impressed neighbors and community leaders. During this period, Marianne carefully reconstructed her reputation while conducting surveillance of local opportunities. Her apparent reformation and dedication to honest work impressed former acquaintances who were willing to believe in the possibility of redemption and fresh starts. She presented herself as a woman who had learned from past difficulties and was now committed to supporting herself through legitimate domestic employment. The most significant development during this period was her reunion with Joseph Nattrass, a former romantic partner whose return to West Auckland created new possibilities for companionship and financial security. The renewed relationship was complicated by Nattrass's knowledge of Marianne's past activities, making him simultaneously valuable as an ally and dangerous as someone who possessed potentially incriminating information about her previous conduct, Joseph. Nattrass's return to Marianne's life in 1871 created a relationship dynamic unlike any she had previously experienced. Nattrass possessed intimate knowledge of her character and methods, making him a partner rather than a victim in her activities. The reunion represented both opportunity for companionship and significant risk, as Nattrass could provide protection and assistance while simultaneously posing threats through his detailed knowledge of her criminal history. The partnership that developed between Marianne and Nattrass was complicated by financial pressures and the need to maintain appearances within the West Auckland community. Both individuals were seeking stability and security, but their shared knowledge of each other's capabilities created a relationship based on mutual dependence, rather than the traditional power dynamics that had characterized Marianne's previous marriages and romantic attachments. Marianne's pregnancy with Nattrass's child in 1871 created urgent financial needs while limiting her mobility and options. The prospect of supporting another dependent without reliable income from a traditional marriage arrangement forced her to consider increasingly risky strategies for generating revenue. The birth of Margaret Edith Cotton Nattrass in January 1872 added another layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. The financial pressures intensified when it became clear that Nattrass's employment prospects were limited and unreliable. His health had been affected by years of difficult working conditions, and his earning capacity was insufficient to support the expanded household that now included Marianne, their infant daughter, and Charles Edward Cotton, the stepson whose custody Marianne had regained from his relatives. Nattrass's death in March 1872 followed patterns that were becoming familiar to West Auckland residents. though his demise created more scrutiny than Marianne's previous activities had attracted. His recent return to the community and the circumstances of his illness raised questions among neighbors who had begun to notice the unusual mortality rate associated with Marianne's household. The situation was becoming increasingly difficult to manage without attracting official attention. Charles Edward Cotton's presence in Mary Ann's household represented both her greatest opportunity and her most dangerous vulnerability. The 7-year-old boy was entitled to a modest inheritance from his father's estate, money that Mary Ann desperately needed to address her mounting financial difficulties. However, his death would need to be managed with extraordinary care, as too many fatalities connected to Mary Ann. Cotton might finally force even the most trusting community to ask difficult questions. Mary Ann's campaign to regain custody of Charles Edward from his relatives had been masterful in its manipulation of Victorian sentiments about maternal devotion and family responsibility. She presented herself as the natural guardian for the child, emphasizing her commitment to honoring his father's memory by providing proper care and education. The community viewed her successful custody battle as evidence of genuine maternal feeling and moral character. Charles Edward's integration into Mary Ann's household initially appeared successful, with neighbors commenting on her apparent dedication to the child's welfare and education. She ensured his regular attendance at school and maintained his appearance and behavior in ways that reflected well on her guardianship. The boy seemed healthy and content, showing no obvious signs of the fate that awaited him. However, Mary Ann's financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate by early 1872. The costs of maintaining her household, combined with limited income opportunities and the expenses associated with caring for an infant daughter, created pressures that demanded immediate solutions. Charles Edward's inheritance represented the most accessible source of funds, but accessing it would require his death, a risk that Mary Ann felt compelled to take. Despite the growing scrutiny her activities had begun to attract, the child's final illness began in July 1872 with symptoms that local residents recognized as similar to those that had affected other individuals connected to Mary Ann's household. His rapid decline and death on July 12, 1872, occurred under circumstances that were too suspicious for the local medical community to ignore. Dr. William Kilburn's decision to delay issuing a death certificate pending investigation would prove to be the decision that finally exposed Mary Ann Cotton's decades of criminal activity. Dr. William Byers. Kilburn's refusal to issue Charles Edward Cotton's death certificate without further investigation marked the beginning of the end for Mary Ann's criminal career. Unlike previous physicians who had attended her victims, Dr. Kilburn possessed both the professional curiosity and the time necessary to ask difficult questions about the suspicious circumstances surrounding the child's death and the disturbing pattern of mortality that seemed to follow Mary Ann Cotton wherever she established residence. The investigation began when Thomas Riley, the assistant coroner for County Durham, ordered Charles Edward's body to be exhumed for forensic examination. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Thomas Scattergood, revealed evidence of deliberate administration of harmful substances in quantities that could not be explained by accidental exposure or legitimate medical treatment. The findings provided the first scientific proof of criminal activity in what had previously been dismissed as tragic but natural deaths. As word of the investigation spread throughout West Auckland and surrounding communities, former neighbors and acquaintances began coming forward with information about other suspicious deaths that had occurred in households where Mary Ann had lived. The police investigation, led by Superintendent Henderson, began the systematic work of tracing Mary Ann's movements and relationships across multiple counties and decades of activity. James Robinson, Mary Ann's former partner from Sunderland, provided crucial testimony about his own confrontation with her years earlier and his long-held suspicions about her involvement in the deaths of children under her care. His willingness to testify publicly about his accusations gave credibility to other witnesses, who had harbored private doubts but had been reluctant to voice suspicions about a woman who appeared so respectable and devoted to family welfare. The emerging investigation revealed not just the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, but a systematic pattern of death that included multiple husbands, numerous children and stepchildren, and several other relatives and acquaintances whose deaths had consistently benefited Mary Ann, while eliminating individuals who represented financial burdens or potential complications to her plans. The scope of the criminal activity was unprecedented in British legal history, establishing Mary Ann Cotton as one of the most prolific criminals of the Victorian era. Mary Ann Cotton's arrest on July 18, 1872, brought to an end nearly 20 years of criminal activity that had been disguised as personal misfortune and natural tragedy. Charged initially with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, she faced the growing likelihood that additional charges would follow as investigators continued to uncover the full scope of her activities across multiple jurisdictions and decades of calculated criminal behavior. The case attracted unprecedented national attention even before formal proceedings began, with newspapers across Britain reporting every detail of what was already being recognized as one of the most shocking criminal cases in English history. The British public was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the revelation that a woman who appeared so maternal and respectable could be capable of such systematic and calculated criminal activity. Over such an extended period, Mary Ann's trial began on March 5th, 1873, at Durham Assizes before Mr. Justice Archibald. The prosecution, led by Sir Charles Russell, presented a comprehensive case that traced her criminal activities across 2 decades and multiple counties, demonstrating a consistent pattern of behavior that was too systematic and too beneficial to be attributed to natural causes or mere coincidence. The evidence was methodical and overwhelming, combining scientific findings with witness testimony and documentary evidence. The defense team, led by Mr. Campbell Foster, attempted to portray Mary Ann as a victim of circumstance and societal prejudice, arguing that the deaths in her household were the result of natural causes, exacerbated by the harsh living conditions common among the working class. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence showing Mary Ann actually administering harmful substances to any of her alleged victims, suggesting that scientific evidence might be explained by environmental contamination or other innocent causes. However, the prosecution's case was too comprehensive and the pattern of criminal behavior too clear to be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty, bringing to conclusion one of the most significant criminal cases in British legal history. Mary Ann Cotton was executed by hanging at Durham County Jail on March 24, 1873, maintaining her innocence to the end and claiming that she was the victim of prejudice and circumstantial evidence rather than guilty of the crimes for which she had been convicted. Her case led to significant improvements in British law enforcement, medical practice, and poison control regulations, while establishing her place in criminal history as one of England's most notorious criminals and a dark symbol of the hidden dangers that could exist beneath the surface of Victorian respectability.